There's a moment, and I know you felt it too, even if you can't name it, where the universe gets very, very quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not the kind you find on a Sunday morning when the coffee's still hot and the birds are doing their thing outside the window. I'm talking about the other kind. The kind where everything that was loud goes silent all at once, where the wind stops, where your own heartbeat sounds like something knocking on a door from the inside. That's the kind of quiet I'm talking about. The kind that means something just changed. I was sitting in my survival tent, this beat-up, patched-together thing I'd been hauling across 4 sectors of the caveth expanse for 11 months, and I heard them. Before I saw them, before I even knew what they were, I heard them. 2 small sounds, low, wet, uncertain. And something in my chest, something that doesn't have a name in any language I know, went completely still. Let me back up. Because you're not going to understand what happened that night unless you understand what the caveth expanse actually is. And most of you watching this, most of you who have never been posted out past the Aldrian Rim, you probably know it from briefings and holo feeds and maybe that one documentary the Galactic Coalition put out 3 years ago. The one where they made it look clean and manageable, and like the whole thing was under control. It wasn't. It isn't. The caveth expanse is one of the 17 contested zones along the outer meridian of what used to be called the Sovereignty Belt. Before the wars, I say, the wars like there was a clear beginning and end, which there wasn't, but that's what we call them. Before all that, the caveth expanse was a thriving ecological corridor. 7 distinct biomes, hundreds of registered species, indigenous populations from 2 pre-contact civilizations that had, remarkably, managed to coexist for about 4,000 years without wiping each other out. Then the Galactic Coalition showed up. Then the Drain Collective showed up. Then 3 other factions whose names I still can't pronounce correctly showed up, and suddenly a thriving ecological corridor became a battlefield, and then a ruin, and then a graveyard, and then something that doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories, something worse maybe, something sadder. A place that used to be alive and is now just waiting, trying to figure out what it's supposed to be now. I was posted there as a Tier 2 survival specialist. That's the official title. What it actually means is that the Coalition sent me 1 human, with a pack, a tent, a med kit, a scanner, and a sidearm I was technically not supposed to use without written authorization from a field commander, into one of the most ecologically devastated zones in the outer sectors, with orders to conduct a baseline environmental survey and report back every 72 hours. By myself. No support unit, no aerial coverage, no embedded team. 1 human, 1 tent, 11 months. I'll let you sit with that for a second. The tent was a Terran-manufactured Helix 9 survival shelter. Which sounds impressive. In practice, it was about the size of a very small bedroom, made of a self-sealing polymer composite that could handle temperatures ranging from -40 to +90 Celsius, and it had a solar-reactive heating mesh woven into the floor that kept things just warm enough to not kill you. I'd customized it over the months, added a secondary thermal layer on the north-facing panel because the prevailing winds in Sector 7 came from the north and they were vicious. Patched 3 separate tiers in the outer skin with repair gel that had gone slightly wrong, so there were these orange streaks across the gray surface that made the whole thing look like it had been in a fight, which honestly it had. Rigged a small water reclamation unit to the drainage valve, so I wasn't relying entirely on filtered groundwater. Hung a photograph on the interior support strut, just a small one, printed on actual paper, which was an indulgence I didn't apologize for, of my sister's dog, a big ridiculous golden retriever named Pudding, sitting in a pile of autumn leaves with an expression of total satisfaction. I'd look at that photograph when things got bad, which they did regularly. The tent was my whole world for 11 months. It was where I slept and ate and filled out the survey forms and argued with myself and cried twice and laughed at my own jokes because there was nobody else to laugh at them. It was approximately 14 square meters of human-engineered polymer standing against everything the caveth expanse wanted to throw at me. It held. Mostly. Month 7 is when things started getting strange. I don't mean strange in the way that months 1 through 6 weren't strange. Those were plenty strange. Month 2, I'd found the remains of what appeared to be a drain-forward base that had been, there's no delicate way to say this, completely dismantled. Not bombed. Not burned. Taken apart. Methodically. Like someone had sat down with the drain base and carefully removed every component and laid them out in a pattern that I couldn't decode, but that felt undeniably intentional. Month 4, I'd followed a signal trace to a canyon in Sector 4 and found 17 coalition survey drones, different deployment waves, different models, different years, all collected in one place. Not damaged, just sitting there, together, like they'd been gathered. Month 6, I'd heard something at night that my scanner couldn't identify. Large, moving in a pattern that suggested intelligence. Gone by morning, and whatever it was had avoided my perimeter sensors entirely, which shouldn't have been possible. But month 7 was different. Month 7 was when I saw the dead one. I almost stepped on it. I was crossing a stretch of open ground between two collapsed structures, the ruins of what had been, according to my survey maps, some kind of communal building for one of the pre-contact civilizations. The architecture was striking even in its destruction. Thick stone analog walls curved in a way that suggested acoustic design, and the remnants of what might have been murals were still faintly visible on some of the interior surfaces, colors gone pale and fragile with time and weather. I was documenting one of those murals, moving carefully, watching my footing because the ground around ruins was always unpredictable, when I almost stepped on it. It was lying in a shallow depression, half hidden by the overgrowth that was slowly, stubbornly reclaiming the ruins. My boot came down maybe 30 centimeters from it. I felt the wrong softness under my sole, looked down, and then I stopped moving. I stood there for probably a full minute before I could process what I was looking at. I don't have a perfect species designation even now. My scanner later gave me a partial match to a creature catalogued in the pre-war ecological records, something called a vethkai, registered native species of the caveth expanse. Quadrupedal, approximately the size of a large terrestrial bear, though the body plan was different, shorter neck, broader skull, that distinctive double-jointedness in the rear limbs that you see in some of the expanse fauna. Covered in a dense, layered coat that had once been, I could tell even in death, extraordinarily beautiful. Deep amber at the base, shifting through ochre and deep red toward the tips. Like fire but slow, like something that had learned to carry warmth. It was dead, had been dead, I estimated, for somewhere between 12 and 18 hours. There were no visible injuries, no signs of predation. The scanner flagged possible starvation and exposure, which in the context of the caveth expanse, stripped of its food networks, its ecological balance wrecked by 7 years of warfare and the chemical runoff from coalition and drain military operations, was not surprising. It was not surprising, and it was also terrible, and I stood there for longer than I should have, longer than was professionally appropriate for a survey specialist filling out an environmental baseline report, and I just looked at it. And then I heard the sound. It came from approximately 2 meters to my right, behind a section of collapsed wall. Not a loud sound, not a threatening sound. A small sound, multiple small sounds, actually overlapping, that my brain categorized before my training kicked in. Young, that's what my brain said. Whatever is making that sound is young. I moved toward the wall slowly, hands visible, no sudden movements. I'd worked with enough non-human fauna across enough field postings to know that you move slow. You don't tower if you can help it, and you let whatever is there decide how close is too close. I came around the edge of the collapsed wall, and I found them. 2 cubs, Vethkai cubs. They were pressed together against the interior corner of the ruin, as close to the wall as they could get. The larger one had its body curved around the smaller one in a protective arc, or what it probably hoped was protective, given that it was itself no bigger than a medium-sized dog. Both of them were looking at me. Not fleeing, not threatening, looking. Their eyes were remarkable. I don't know how else to say that without sounding sentimental, but they were large, amber-toned, the same fire colors as their coats, and in them was an expression that I have spent months trying to find the right word for. The closest I've gotten is this. They looked like they had already lost everything once, and were waiting to see if they were about to lose it again. I crouched down, got myself to their level, didn't reach out, didn't make sounds, just crouched there. The larger cub made a sound, low, rough-edged, something between a warning and a question. The smaller one pressed tighter into its sibling's side. I said out loud, in the ruins of a building that had stood for maybe 4,000 years before human beings arrived and broke everything, "I'm not going to hurt you." Which was a ridiculous thing to say. They couldn't understand Terran standard. They were alien fauna in a destroyed ecosystem. The words meant nothing to them. But I meant them. And somehow, and I've thought about this more than I can tell you, somehow that seemed to matter. We stayed like that for a while, me crouched, them watching, the wind moving through the ruins, the scanner in my jacket pocket running quiet background analysis that I wasn't paying attention to. Eventually I stood up slowly and walked back to the dead female. I was now fairly certain that's what she was, based on the scanner data, and on the obvious fact that she had 2 very small cubs hiding in a ruin nearby, and I stayed there for another moment. Then I looked back at where the cubs were hiding. Then I looked at the scanner data, which was telling me that temperature was dropping, that the region was entering a cold weather front that would bring below zero conditions within approximately 4 hours, and that the nearest stable shelter within these ruins that might provide adequate thermal protection was not adequate. I stood there, and then I picked up my pack and I went back to the cubs. "Okay," I said, to 2 alien animals who couldn't understand me, in the ruins of a building that belonged to a civilization that the people who built my tent had helped destroy, with night coming in fast and the temperature already starting to bite. "Here's what's going to happen." The larger cub made that sound again, rough, uncertain. "I have a tent," I said. "It has a heated floor. I have 2 field rations left in my pack, and I don't actually know if you can eat Terran protein blocks, but I'm going to figure that out." I paused. "I also have a photograph of a dog named Pudding, which is not relevant, but I wanted you to know." The smaller cub had moved slightly out from behind its sibling, just slightly, nose working, testing the air, trying to decide something. "I know you don't know me," I said. "I know you have absolutely no reason to trust me. I know what humans, what the coalition, what we did to this place." I had to stop for a moment. "I know you've been here alone. I know what was lying out there." I swallowed. "I'm sorry for all of it." The larger cub blinked, slowly, and then it made a different sound, softer, shorter, ending on a rising note that I'd have called questioning in any context. "I know," I said. "Me too. I won't pretend the next hour was easy or graceful. Getting 2 terrified, grieving, recently orphaned alien cubs to follow a strange bipedal human across open ground in the dark requires approximately none of the skills my Tier 2 survival specialist training covered. What it required was patience, and moving very slowly, and sitting down in the dirt approximately 9 times when one or both of them stopped moving, and I needed to reset the situation. And once, memorably, lying completely flat on the ground for about 6 minutes because the smaller cub had spooked at something, and the only thing that seemed to help was me getting as horizontal as possible, which I don't fully understand but which worked. We got there. I set up the tent entrance at the lowest position it would go, because the normal entry height was designed for an adult human, and these cubs were small, and the last thing I wanted was for them to feel like they were being asked to enter a human-sized space without any choice. I went in first, left the entrance open, sat in the middle of the heated floor, and waited. It took 22 minutes. I know because I was watching the timer on my scanner. 22 minutes, and then the larger cub poked its nose through the entrance. Then its head. Then, with a kind of careful, deliberate caution that I found genuinely moving, its entire body. It turned around immediately and looked at where its sibling was still sitting outside, and made a sound, soft, sustained, coaxing, and then the smaller one came in too. They stood just inside the entrance, pressed together, looking at me. I kept my hands visible, didn't move, let them take in the space. The tent hummed. The heating mesh in the floor was running at about 60%. The temperature inside was already significantly warmer than outside, where the cold front was starting to arrive. I could hear the wind picking up, could feel the slight vibration of the polymer skin. The larger cub took one step toward the heated floor, then another. It sat down. After a moment, the smaller one sat beside it. And we all just sat there together in the tent while the storm came in outside, and I thought, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do now, and somehow that was okay. The night was long. Outside, the cold front became a proper storm. The kind the Cavith Expanse did regularly in its 7th-month cycle, deep atmosphere pressure drops that had been, pre-war, a normal part of the seasonal pattern, part of what kept the ecological corridor functioning. Post-war they were still happening, but wrong. Too cold at the low points, too erratic in their timing. Another thing the wars had broken that nobody was going to fix. Inside the tent, I stayed still and let the cubs do what they needed to do. The larger one, I started thinking of it as Ember for the color, circled the interior of the tent twice, tested each wall with its nose, came back and sat near me, not next to me, near me, about 60 centimeters of distance that felt significant. The smaller one, Cinder, in my head, because it had this reddish-gray shading at its neck that caught the tent's light and reminded me of exactly that. The smaller one was watching me with those amber eyes like it was trying to solve a complex problem. I opened one of my field rations, the protein blocks that I was genuinely uncertain about, but which were the only food I had, and broke off a piece, set it on the floor between us, didn't offer it directly, just put it there. Ember investigated it, sniffed it from approximately 4 different angles, which took a while. Then it ate it, with the careful deliberateness of an animal that had learned to be cautious about what it consumed. Cinder watched Ember not die, and then came forward and ate the rest of the piece. I opened the second ration and ate my half. We were all eating together in the tent while the storm howled outside, and I found that genuinely profound, which is probably a very human thing to say. They fell asleep in the early hours. I watched it happen, which sounds strange, but I mean it simply. I was awake, running my survey notes, trying to document the Vethkai encounter in the way my mission parameters required, and I was watching them with part of my attention, and I saw the exact moment it happened. Ember went down first, just folded slowly onto the heated floor, its legs tucking under it, its big amber head dropping onto its forelegs with this small, exhausted sigh. Cinder lasted a little longer. It was sitting up, watching me, and then it blinked slowly, once, twice, and then it shifted sideways until it was pressed against Ember's back and its eyes closed. And they slept. I sat there looking at them for a while, my scanner balanced on my knee, my survey notes half finished. For the first time, looking at those 2 small creatures sleeping in a heated tent on a destroyed planet, I felt something I hadn't felt in 11 months of solo fieldwork in a wasteland. Something that felt, cautiously, like it might be the right thing being done in the wrong situation. Like maybe, 1, very small part of the accounting was evening out. Let me tell you something about the Vethkai, because I've been studying everything I could find about them since that night, and what I've found has stayed with me. Pre-war population estimates. The ecological surveys done in the 40 years before the sovereignty belt conflicts began put Vethkai numbers at somewhere between 80,000 and 120,000 individuals across the Kavith expanse. They were a keystone species, as it turned out, not just ecologically, though they were that too, their movement patterns and feeding habits doing crucial work in seed dispersal and soil aeration across the biomes, but culturally. The pre-contact civilizations of the Kavith expanse, both of them, had significant relationships with the Vethkai. The archaeological record suggests reverence. The murals I'd been documenting, the ones on the walls of the building where I'd found Ember and Cinder, many of them featured Vethkai, in ceremonial contexts, in what appeared to be protective or guardian roles, in imagery that placed them not as animals to be used or feared, but as companions, as co-inheritors of the land. Post-war surveys, the ones I was conducting, current population estimates, fewer than 2,000 individuals, scattered, fragmented, losing cohesion, losing the social structures that the pre-war records suggested were essential to their development and survival. Fewer than 2,000. Down from 100,000. In 7 years. I wrote that number in my survey notes a lot, those 11 months. Not because I needed to, not because the mission parameters required repeated notation. I wrote it because it helped me remember what I was actually doing there, what the stakes were, what the numbers meant in terms of actual, individual, irreplaceable lives. 80,000 down to 2,000, and 2 of those 2,000 were asleep on my tent floor. Morning came gray and cold, the storm having blown through and left behind the particular silence of post-weather expanse landscape. Everything scrubbed clean, every surface wet, the air tasting of whatever the Kavith expanse's atmosphere had that was different from Earth standard. Slightly higher nitrogen content, trace elements that my filtration system handled, and my body had largely adapted to over 11 months, a faint mineral quality that I'd stopped noticing sometime around month 3. Ember woke first. There was a moment I saw it clearly where it woke and didn't immediately know where it was. Its head came up, its body tensed, and in that fraction of a second it was pure animal. Threat assessment, spatial orientation, identification of the nearest exit. Then it saw me. I was sitting against the far wall with my coffee, actual coffee, reconstituted from a powder, the one genuine luxury I'd packed. And I held very still, and I kept my expression as neutral as I could manage, which is to say open, non-threatening, what I hoped read as friendly. Ember looked at me for a long moment. Then it settled back down. That was it, that was the whole thing. Woke up in an unfamiliar place, saw me, settled back down. I'm not going to overstate what that meant. I'm not going to say it was trust, exactly, not yet, not after one night. But it was something. It was a choice being made, quickly and without a lot of apparent deliberation, by an animal that had every reason to choose otherwise. Cinder woke up and immediately wanted to explore. I'd secured my equipment before sleeping, force of habit after 11 months of field work, so there wasn't much within reach that was immediately dangerous. The scanner, my personal data pad, my med kit, my extra thermal layer folded in the corner. Cinder investigated all of these with systematic thoroughness, nudging each one with its nose, occasionally pressing a paw against them, and once, memorably, picking up my folded thermal layer and carrying it approximately 2 meters before apparently deciding it didn't need it and dropping it on top of Ember, who startled awake and gave Cinder a look of such pointed exasperation that I laughed out loud. It was the first time I'd laughed like that, genuinely, startled out of me, in I don't know how long. Both cubs looked at me when I laughed, their heads tilted at almost exactly the same angle. "Sorry," I said, "that was funny, you wouldn't understand." Cinder made that questioning sound, the rising note one, and then went back to investigating my datapad. Day 2. I had a mission. I had survey requirements, 72-hour reporting windows, a vast amount of ground to cover in Sector 7 before my rotation ended and I was extracted. I had work to do. I also had 2 Vethkai cubs who had, apparently, decided that the strange biped's heated shelter was where they were going to be. I tried gently to let them go on their own. I opened the tent entrance, left it open, moved around the exterior doing my survey work while keeping the entrance accessible. Neither of them left. Ember sat at the entrance and watched me work. Cinder alternated between watching from the entrance and making strategic raids on any piece of my equipment that hadn't been properly secured. At midday, I sat down outside with my lunch, another protein block, some dried fruit I'd been rationing carefully, and Ember came out and sat next to me, about 40 centimeters away, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from its coat. We ate lunch together. I thought about what my mission parameters said about contact with native fauna. I thought about the Coalition's official position on ecological intervention in contested zones, which was complicated and deeply hypocritical, and I didn't need to think about right now. I thought about what was right. I ate my dried fruit. Ember investigated a small beetle that had emerged from the wet ground after the storm and decided, apparently, that beetles were not worth pursuing. Cinder was asleep in the tent. After a while, Ember made a sound I hadn't heard before, low, long, almost musical, not directed at me, directed outward at the landscape, at everything. I didn't know what it meant. I still don't know exactly what it meant. But I know how it made me feel, sitting there next to that amber-coated, fire-colored creature in the ruins of a world we'd helped break. It made me feel like something needed to be done. Day 3. I filed my 72-hour report. In the section for notable observations, which was supposed to document things like geological anomalies and signs of new vegetation growth and weather pattern data, I wrote about the Vethkai. I wrote about the female I'd found. I wrote about the cubs. I wrote about their condition, their behavior, the fact that they were alive in Sector 7 where, according to all previous survey data, no Vethkai had been detected in 14 months. I documented it honestly. I documented the fact that they had entered my shelter and spent the night. I documented their apparent health status. Underfed but not critically, dehydrated. The smaller cub had a minor laceration on one hind limb that I'd treated with BioSeal from my med kit on night 2 when Cinder had let me close enough to assess it, which itself had taken about 2 hours of patient negotiation. I sent the report. Within 6 hours, I had a response, not from the standard field coordinator, from someone at the Coalition's Ecological Recovery Division, whose name I recognized from the pre-war survey literature. The message said, "Confirm observation. Do not attempt to relocate subjects. Continue monitoring. Full assessment team deploying Caveth Expanse Sector 7, ETA 14 days. 14 days. I read that message 3 times. Then I looked at Ember, who was sitting at my feet watching me read, and I said, 14 days. We can do 14 days. Ember made the musical sound again. Yeah, I said, me too. Those 14 days were the strangest and best days of my posting in the Caveth Expanse. I'll tell you a few things about them. Day 5. I was mapping a stretch of ground about 2 kilometers from the tent when my scanner flagged movement behind me. I turned around honestly expecting some kind of threat, because that was what my nervous system had calibrated to after 11 months, and found Ember standing about 20 meters back, watching me, having apparently followed me on my survey route. I'd left Cinder in the tent, which Cinder had accepted because Cinder had found a comfortable position on my folded thermal layer and seemed content to remain there indefinitely. Ember had followed me. I walked my route. Ember walked mine behind me. When I stopped to document something, Ember stopped. When I moved on, Ember moved. It never came within about 8 meters of me during the day. Out in the open, that distance seemed important to it, seemed to be where it felt secure, but it was there. The whole time. I don't know why it did this. I've thought about it. Maybe it was protective behavior, some instinct toward guarding, toward staying near something it had identified as safe. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something I don't have a framework for because I'm human and Ember was a Vethkai, and we don't share a cognitive architecture. But it followed me, and I found that I walked differently knowing it was there, more carefully, more slowly, more aware of what the ground looked like, what the ruins looked like, what the landscape had once been and might be again. Day 7, Cinder found the photograph of Pudding. I don't know how. The photograph was pinned to the support strut about 1.5 meters off the ground, which required some determined effort to reach. But I came back to the tent to find Cinder sitting beneath the strut looking up at the photograph with an expression of absolute fascination. I sat down beside it. We both looked at the photograph for a while. Pudding in her pile of autumn leaves, completely satisfied with her existence. "That's a dog," I said. "Different planet, very different, but also warm, also good company." I paused. "She's alive, I think. She would be 11 now, old for her kind, but she was always robust." Cinder made a sound, not the warning sound, the soft one. "I miss her," I said. "I miss a lot of things, but I'm here and you're here and that's the situation." Cinder put its head on my knee. I sat very still for a long time and didn't say anything, because some things don't need words, and some moments you just have to let be what they are. Day 9, the first time Ember slept directly against me. Not near me, not 60 centimeters away on the heated floor, against me. I'd been writing survey notes late, my lamp on its lowest setting, the tent dark except for that. And I'd stopped noticing exactly where Ember was in the tent, because by this point they both moved around freely during the night and I'd stopped tracking it consciously. I noticed when the weight arrived. Ember had curled against my left side, its back against my thigh, its head resting on its own folded paws. Cinder was already against my right side, which it had started doing on day 4. Both of them, one on each side, asleep. I put my datapad down very carefully. I didn't move for a long time. Outside, the caveth expanse was dark and quiet and ruined, and full of things that had been lost. Inside this small tent, this 14 square meter pocket of heated polymer and soft light, 3 living things were together, and 2 of them were sleeping, and none of them were scared. I don't know what to do with that. Even now, even months later, writing this account, I don't know exactly what to do with it. I know what it felt like, though. It felt like something being repaired that I hadn't known was broken. It felt like an answer to a question I hadn't known I'd been asking, out there in the expanse for 11 months, filling out survey forms and writing numbers that meant 98% decline, and trying to hold onto the knowledge that the work mattered. It felt like this is why. Not to be sentimental about it, but this is why. Day 11, I had the first real confrontation. Not with the Cubs, with the situation. My reporting window brought a different message this time. Not from the Ecological Recovery Division. From my field coordinator, the one who'd been mostly silent for 11 months except for logistics and supply drops, flagging a directive from the Coalition's Military Stabilization Bureau, which operated parallel to, but not subordinate to the Ecological Recovery Division. The directive flagged the Vethkai encounter for review under Contested Zone Wildlife Protocol 7, which was a protocol I'd read exactly once and which I will now summarize for you. It said that in contested zones where active or recently active military operations had occurred, all native fauna interactions must be assessed for potential security implications. Security implications. I read that phrase 4 times. I looked at Ember, who was sitting at the entrance of the tent, watching the morning light come in across the ruined landscape. I looked at Cinder, who was asleep on my thermal layer. Security implications. I wrote back to my field coordinator. I want to reproduce that message fairly accurately because I'm proud of it. I wrote, request clarification on Protocol 7 application to this situation. Subject organisms are 2 juvenile Vethkai cubs, approximately 8 to 10 months old, currently underfed and recovering from maternal loss. Security implications are not apparent to this specialist. Please advise on specific concerns so they can be addressed in field assessment. Note, Coalition Ecological Recovery Division has already initiated deployment response, and I am continuing to follow their direction pending team arrival. Further note, if the security implication of 2 orphaned cubs of a critically endangered species sleeping in a survey tent is that they make humans feel things, then I would argue that is not a security problem. That is, in fact, the point. I got no response to that message. I chose to interpret the silence as agreement. Day 13. 1 day before the assessment team was scheduled to arrive. I spent that day doing something I hadn't done in 11 months of field work, and that the mission parameters absolutely did not require, and that I was going to do anyway. I went back to the ruins where I'd found Ember and Cinder, where their mother was. I'd marked the location in my scanner data. The body had been there for 12 days now. I'm not going to describe what 12 days in the Cavith Expanse climate does, except to say that the process is what it is, and I handled it as well as I could. I dug a grave with my field shovel, which took 3 hours because the ground around the ruins was ancient and compacted and didn't want to yield, and I buried her. I didn't have any ritual for it. I'm not religious in any formal sense. I don't know what, if anything, the Vethkai do when they lose their own. The pre-war records suggest complex social mourning behavior, but the records were incomplete. I stood at the grave for a while, said what I could say, which was limited, which was mostly just. She was beautiful and she should have lived, and I'm sorry for what we did to this place, and I'll look after them for as long as I can. Then I went back to the tent. Both cubs were at the entrance when I returned, waiting. Ember looked at me for a long moment, sniffed my boots. I'd walked through the ruins. I carried the smell of the place. It made a sound that I hadn't heard before. Quiet, sustained, something that hurt to hear. Then it went inside the tent. Then Cinder followed. Then I followed. And we sat together in the tent in the failing light of the 13th day, and nobody needed to say anything. Day 14. The assessment team arrived in the early afternoon. They were 8 people, 4 from the Coalition's Ecological Recovery Division, 2 from a joint research initiative I wasn't familiar with, 1 veterinary specialist, 1 who was introduced to me as a cultural ecological liaison, which turned out to mean someone who specialized in the relationship between the pre-contact civilizations and the fauna of the Cavith Expanse, which was a field I hadn't known existed and immediately wanted to learn everything about. They arrived in 2 vehicles, crested the ridge above the ruined area, and began making their way down toward where I'd set up the tent in a depression that offered good wind protection. I was outside when they arrived. The cubs were inside. The lead researcher, Dr. Vantha Orisol, I can use her name because she's given me permission to in this account, came to me first. She was tall, Aldrian, with the characteristic triple pigmentation patterns on her face that I'd gotten used to seeing in some of the Coalition personnel, and that I still found genuinely striking. She looked at me, she looked at the tent. She said in very careful Terran standard, "The cubs are inside." "Yes. They've been with you since day 1. Since night 1. They came in during the storm." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We've been tracking Vethkai in Sector 7 for 3 years. We had not confirmed any living individuals in 14 months. I know, I said. I read the prior survey data. You found them in the ruins. Almost stepped on the female. The cubs were in the interior. She was quiet again, looking at the tent. How are they? Better than they were. The smaller one had a laceration treated. They were underfed when I found them, less so now. I've been splitting my field rations. I paused. I want to flag that I went outside the mission parameters in multiple respects over the last 2 weeks, and I'll write whatever I need to write to document that, but... Stop, she said, not unkindly. You found 2 Vethkai cubs in an area with no confirmed individuals, and you sheltered them during a cold front storm, and have been caring for them for 14 days while documenting their condition and behavior for our assessment. Yes. You'll write the standard contact report and I'll sign off on it, she said. The mission parameters do not adequately cover everything that happens in a contested zone, which is something I've been trying to get revised for 3 years. She looked at the tent again. May I meet them? What happened next is something I've thought about every day since. Dr. Orisel approached the tent slowly, following my guidance. Low and steady, no sudden movements. She asked me to stay close in case the cubs needed a familiar reference point. Ember heard her coming. I watched the tent's exterior for the shadow movement that told me Ember was positioning near the entrance, that threshold behavior I'd noticed, the way it monitored anything approaching. I crouched at the entrance. It's okay, I said, knowing they couldn't understand the words and knowing somehow it still mattered that I said them. These are people who want to help, same as me, different looking, different smell, but the same thing. Dr. Orisel crouched beside me. Ember was visible just inside the entrance, watching. And then something happened that Dr. Orisel later told me she'd never seen in 3 years of Vethkai field study. In all the limited and fragmentary observations they'd managed of the remaining population. Ember looked at me, then looked at her, then came through the entrance and sat down directly between us, not behind me, not retreating back inside, between. Dr. Orisel made a very quiet sound, something that wasn't quite a word in any language I knew. Ember looked at her, sniffed the air, made that musical sound, the long, outward one, and then turned and went back inside. Cinder came to the entrance briefly, looked at Dr. Orisel with those amber eyes, and then went back to my thermal layer. Dr. Orisel didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Do you know what the pre-contact records say about Vethkai behavior toward strangers?" "I've been reading what I could find," I said. "Cautious, territorial in the wild state, strong social bonds within family groups." "Yes," she said. "And one more thing. The cultural liaison researcher Yamara, she's been translating the mural records from this site for 2 years, the ones you've been documenting, the Vethkai imagery." "I know the murals," I said. "I've been photographing them since month 4. "The pre-contact culture's called the Vethkai, the ones who decide," she said. "There's a recurring concept in the records, the idea that Vethkai had the ability to recognize something in other beings, not species, not size or power, something else." She paused. "The translation is approximate. The closest rendering is those who will not take more than the world can give." I sat with that for a moment. "They chose you," she said. "Not because you're human, not because you're safe in any physical sense. Because of something they read in you." I didn't say anything. "We have a great deal to learn from this observation," she said, "and I think you should know that what you've done here will be part of the formal recovery record, not just as a data point, as a," she paused, seeming to search for the right word, "a proof of concept." "Of what?" She looked at the tent, at the 2 shadows visible through the polymer skin, curled together on the heated floor. "That something can be repaired," she said. "I left the Caveth Expanse 3 weeks after the assessment team arrived. My rotation was ending. There was paperwork, There was a debrief. There was a supply shuttle that didn't wait. The assessment team was staying. They'd secured an 18-month extension of operations in Sector 7, and researcher Yamara was establishing a semi-permanent documentation station at the ruined site. The veterinary specialist was setting up a field monitoring program for the Vethkai cubs. Ember and Cinder were staying. Of course they were staying. They were Vethkai, not pets, not my responsibility in any ownership sense, not something I could take with me or should. They belonged to the Caveth expanse. They were part of the recovery program now, which was the right thing, which was what I'd wanted. I knew all of that. Leaving was still hard. I broke down the tent on the last morning, rolled up the heated floor mat, took down the interior support struts, took down the photograph of Pudding. Both cubs were outside while I did it. They'd learned, over 14 days, not to be inside when I was packing or unpacking, which had been an early logistical challenge I'd solved through patient repetition. They sat together about 10 meters away and watched me dismantle their shelter. When the tent was packed, this beat-up, patched-together thing with its orange repair gel streaks and its salvaged thermal layer and its memories of 11 months, I picked up my pack. Ember stood up. It walked toward me, slowly, the way it had learned to move around me, measured, deliberate, communicating each step before it happened. It came to about 1 meter away, the closest it had ever been to me in daylight outside. I crouched down. Ember looked at me with those amber eyes for a long time. Then it did something. It lowered its head slowly until its nose almost touched the ground in front of my feet, and held it there. I don't know what that gesture means in Vethkai social communication. Researcher Yamara later told me that the precontact records contained similar imagery, the lowered head associated with the concept of acknowledgement, of recognition, of something closer to "I know what you are" than to any human concept of thanks. I know what you are. I put my hand out, flat, palm down, the way you'd offer your hand to any animal you wanted to read your scent, and Ember touched its nose to the back of my hand briefly, gently, and then raised its head. Cinder had come forward too. It head-butted my knee once, with the particular force of a cub that didn't fully understand its own size yet, which almost knocked me over and which made me laugh in the same startled, real way I'd laughed on day 2. Then I stood up. And I picked up my pack. And I walked to the shuttle. I'm writing this account 8 months later, back in a regular posting on a station in the outer meridian that has reliable gravity and hot showers, and a commissary that serves something approximating actual food. I have regular updates from the Caveth Expanse field team. Ember and Cinder are thriving. Their weight is in the healthy range now. They've been observed interacting with 3 other Vethkai individuals in Sector 7, the first confirmed interindividual Vethkai contact in the region in almost 2 years. The assessment team believes there may be a small surviving population in the deeper zones of Sector 7, and they're deploying more scanner arrays to confirm. The mural documentation at the ruin site has produced findings that researcher Yamara describes as paradigm shifting for understanding the precontact civilizations, though the formal publication is still pending. The Coalition's Military Stabilization Bureau sent another inquiry about Protocol 7 3 months ago. Dr. Orisel responded to it. I've read her response. It was significantly more diplomatic than mine had been, and approximately 40 times longer, and it referenced 11 different ecological recovery frameworks and 3 coalition charter documents, and its essential message was the same as mine. These are 2 cubs. Leave them alone. The Bureau has not followed up. There's something I've been trying to say through all of this, and I want to make sure I say it clearly before I end. Humanity made a mess of the Caveth Expanse. Not uniquely, the Drain Collective, the other factions, Everyone who fought over that corridor made their contributions to the ruin, but humanity was there. And humans pulled triggers and signed directives and sent survey specialists alone into ecological war zones and wrote security implications in official documents about orphaned cubs. I don't want to pretend that didn't happen. I don't want the story of me sitting in a tent with two small creatures who had nowhere else to go to become a redemption narrative that makes it all okay. It's not okay. The numbers aren't okay. 80,000 down to 2,000 isn't okay. But here's what I know. Two small things that had every reason to be afraid came into my tent in a storm. They smelled whatever they smelled, read whatever they read in me with those remarkable amber eyes, and they slept. Just slept, right there on the floor pressed together warm. For the first time in however long, since their mother died, maybe longer, maybe since before their mother died, since the wars changed everything, they felt safe enough to sleep. That's the smallest possible unit of repair. That's not fixing anything. That's not making anything right. The numbers don't get better from that. The history doesn't change. But it happened. In that tent on that floor, in the ruins of a world, we helped break two small creatures from a species that had lived in the caveth expanse for hundreds of thousands of years before any of us arrived. They slept. And I sat there and watched the storm outside and listened to them breathe, and I thought, we can be better than what we've been. Not because it fixes what happened, not because the accounting balances. Just because it's true. Just because in the whole mess of everything we've done across every planet and station and sector and zone, in the middle of all of that, a human and two small creatures who had no reason to trust him, trusted him. And they slept. And when they slept, for the first time in a long time, so did I. Field Log, Caveth Expanse Sector 7, Tier 2 Survival Specialist, Terran Coalition Survey Division. Note appended to Final Rotation Report, Personal Addendum. Whatever the mission parameters say, whatever the protocols say, whatever the Bureau sends next, the Vethkai are not a security concern. They are the ones who decide. And they decided right.